Hi, I'm Thomas Bowles, Prince William County Agricultural Extension Agent. Welcome to our video.
So welcome. Thank you for joining us on this extremely beautiful day. Very pleased to have you here with us to talk a little bit about container gardening. My name is Valerie Hilsman. I'm the Natural Resources Specialist for Virginia Cooperative Extension Prince William Unit. And again, thank you very much for joining us. So we'll get right into it. So we're going to talk about container gardening with a little bit of focus on native plants. So why natives? They are extremely well adapted to local conditions. That being said, a container is a slight deviation from the conditions that they're usually used to, but there's still many plants that will perform quite well in kind of the slightly more challenging conditions of having limited soil, potentially more limited moisture, and sometimes even more limited organic material depending on the soil or potting mix used. They, of course, provide ecosystem support, which is so crucial. And even in small balcony-style gardens or small container gardens on back porches and our driveways, these are all great areas that can still provide very necessary and needed ecosystem support and management. So definitely, even though you only have a small garden potentially, you can still do a lot of good for other insects and animals surrounding you. Natural populations do continue to have their normal area threatened. So providing these additional little islands of habitat does make a big difference. Natives are becoming more and more available to purchase. So thinking back to 15 years ago, you could struggle a little bit to find available natives in retail stores. Now, even going to some of our larger, more big box type retail stores, you can find native plants to purchase. And of course, we have so many great organizations in the surrounding area that have native plant sales available. So 100% it is much easier to get natives now than it used to be in the past. And aside from all that, just aesthetically, they are gorgeous plants. And looking at our fern above and our bone set to the side, they have so much to offer us, even just from a beauty standpoint. They are 100% worth planting. So why containers? There's a lot of great reasons to stick with containers or to augment your existing garden with containers. They are very easy to move and rearrange. Say if you have one plant that managed to get chomped down on aphids or some other friendly garden insect, you can place that around to the back, give it some time to recover, and put something else right in front. So there's a lot of benefits to being able to do that that are a little bit more challenging in the more traditional in-soil garden. It's often a lot physically easier to garden using containers and just a lot less bending over. They can be a little bit more visually significant as well, depending on where the containers are placed. And when we have mature trees and other shrubs in our yard that have root systems that we want to make sure that we're very careful around, using containers instead, kind of gently located, can be helpful to not disrupt those roots that we want to make sure stay intact. So definitely another benefit. For small spaces, of course, they are an extreme benefit to have some sort of container in those areas where you really don't have space to do anything else. I've lived in a lot of areas with tiny small yards that have really helped to make sure that I still was able to kind of nurture and support the plants that I had. So I'm very grateful for the concept of container gardening. There's also many colorful variations in all sorts of price ranges. So if you wanted to stick to kind of the basic terracotta clay pot, there are plenty of those available. And there's also a lot more plastic options as well that can really work well, especially for our climate where you can have the more traditional fired pots end up breaking over the winter when we get that freeze and thaw cycle. It can also be easier to amend the soil for host plants when they have special needs. So if you have a plant that's a little bit more tolerant of acidic conditions where they need that more acidic soil, and your soil tends to be a little bit more on the alkaline side, you can definitely augment that soil within those containers a whole lot easier than you could kind of within your general garden area. So that can be another benefit. Things like bog plants or other like wet sort of plant containers, that also can be a nice option too if you want something to support that sort of more wet tolerant plant life. So all of those are other great reasons. HOAs can often be rather detrimental to starting a garden in certain areas if their regulations are a little bit more on the stringent side. So containers are also quite beneficial if you do need to move something around to the side of the yard. If there is a complaint lodged against you, that is definitely another great benefit, to just be able to move stuff around and potentially to work with them to place it in an area that meets all of their requirements. So definitely, I know in some communities, vegetable gardens are not super welcome in front yards, even though that may be the area that you have more light. So putting something in a container and kind of moving it slightly out of sight to the side and readjusting that as other plants in your garden kind of grow and wane, that can be a nice way to make sure you're still able to support the plants that you would like to support. So containers and native plants altogether, they really are a perfect match. It does allow us to experiment with growing conditions, color texture combinations on a small scale, and it truly does maximize our area to help support native ecosystems. So in this case of this balcony here, this was a really awesome example of where this individual with kind of a typical apartment balcony was able to make kind of a mini meadow and fully offer that habitat for visiting birds, insects, all sorts of other wildlife. So I think that's just a truly great example up in Wisconsin of what you can do within container gardening and native plants. So a few other considerations you want to keep in mind. We have the old adage, right plant, right place. That definitely applies to containers for our area, since we do go through that period of frost. We ideally want to have plants that are tolerant of a colder area further up north. So typically you want to take a look at something that is tolerant up to zone 5. So that would exclude some of our more southern species potentially. Another option is you can either move the plant into a more sheltered area. I know that some people often move them into a garage situation where the temperatures will be just a little bit higher if it's a plant that doesn't need the additional light over the winter. That can work. You can also bury it, or you can provide a little bit of insulation around the pot. I've had pretty good luck with, I have maybe about 20 container plants, and generally they will survive. I've had a little bit more problems with trees being a little bit more sensitive, just because their root systems are a little bit more sprawling. I think that they do get a little more affected by some of those colder periods. But I think if you do put just some care and thought into the process, you can make sure that you do get good survival of your perennial plants over the winter. Drainage is also super important. Just like with a lot of our houseplants, overwatering is not a great thing for our container-bound friends. So drainage is very crucial, but of course, making sure that they are getting water on a regular basis, especially during the heat of the summer, like we've had the past few days, is also very, very critical. So including mesh over the hole at the bottom of the pot to allow water to drain out. Sometimes you will hear extensions publications recommend rocks. Sometimes you will hear them not recommend rocks. Generally, just make sure there's drainage. Kind of having that mesh there will allow the water to go out. There is concern of potentially a perched water table where the water is not able to infiltrate kind of a different layer that's below the rest of the soil in your pot. I haven't really had a lot of experience with that in my pots. I have put just rocks in the bottom as kind of a ballast and just to take a little bit of room. And I haven't run into that issue. But definitely, if that is a concern of yours, to make sure the water is infiltrating the whole root system and it's not getting locked up at the base, that can be a nice way just to make sure that watering is within the plant's tolerance. Mosquitoes can also be a concern. So make sure that if you have a saucer underneath the main plant type, that it is getting dumped out regularly. In the summer, about once every 3 days should be sufficient just to be on the very safe side. You could also use a bacterial-based product rated for mosquito management and just sprinkle a little bit of those bits along the bottom. And that can also help to prevent mosquitoes from developing in that water, since a tablespoon is all that they need. So the last four container considerations we'll go over in a little bit more detail just because they deserve a little bit more attention. So container types, really your imagination is the only limiting factor. You can see this really awesome photo at the top from Audubon Society. This is very creative use of old containers, and it looks like it's working very well for these ferns and moss and air plants that this individual has. At the bottom, you can see this really cool cement sort of container that's working well for these plants, and then kind of the more traditional, probably clay, maybe a few plastic pots at the other image to the bottom. So really it's about what aesthetically looks appealing to you and what fits in with the rest of your yard and kind of visual style. You do need to think about size, especially if you're looking at more trees, shrubs, and perennials. About 8 to 10 diameter of plant pots is recommended. So, and that's measured kind of across the pot itself. About a half a gallon or less for smaller plants, like a lot of our herbs can fit in there, like rosemary, basil, etc. So for shrubs and trees, you do want to look at 3 gallons plus, and that just gives room for those shrub and tree roots to develop a little bit more. Another way to consider the amount of space that it needs is to think about cubic feet of growing medium per each square foot of canopy. So they recommend 2 cubic feet. And so if you really want to support a larger tree, you definitely need to think about that. If it's a tree that's going to get on the larger side, like I can think of a nursery that has these beautiful river birch that kind of overshades the rest of the plants that they have. So they had to make sure that volume of soil was sufficient to support them. So that's kind of a good measurement to make sure that you are providing that resource that these trees need. So like we talked about with freezing, containers may require the insulation and then also watering prior to freezing. The watering can be important just to make sure that before we get into these colder temperatures, that water has been provided to these trees and shrubs. Regular watering is also, of course, very important. If you have kind of a more sandier growing medium, that tends to drain really well. And that's what a lot of plants do like. Probably daily watering during the heat of the summer is best. Make sure it runs out the, excuse me, the base of the pot. And that can help to make sure that the plant is getting water to the surrounding roots. And definitely clay pots, I have noticed 100% will dry out a lot sooner than other pot types. So definitely keep an eye on that if you have a variety of pots available, that some of them may get on the drier side depending on what material the pot is made out of. So what should you use to plant your plants in? So sometimes people will bring up just using normal garden soil, normal dirt out of their yards. So in general, it's too compacted, and you're also going to be introducing a lot of potential weeds like crabgrass, Japanese stiltgrass, etc., that would be in your normal garden soil. So generally, it's recommended that you can either go with a commercial mixture that has already been mixed to the proper ratios, and often it's also sterilized. And you do want to make sure that the soil matches the plant type. You can also build your own to be a little bit more earth-friendly and economical. Sand or clay can provide structure. You can use peat, moss, or core to hold water. These can be a little bit more environmentally intensive to harvest. So compost is a little bit more of a sustainable option. But generally, you do want to kind of combine these and mix them all up just so you're getting the plant the ability to get air down to the roots and also water so it doesn't become too compacted. Excuse me. 100% compost can work for smaller plants, and then you can also mix some of that with commercial soil mixture. I have done that with pretty good results myself. Out of curiosity, I tried a 100% compost mix to try to grow some lettuce in over the summer. It didn't turn out too well. It was very highly compacted just because it was such fine compost. I think it was like a top dressing sort of compost. I think if you got kind of less of a kind of mixed and composted substrate, it might work a little bit better. So do definitely pay attention to the texture when you're thinking about it. And the good news with pots is you can always experiment and start again. You're not losing a major component of your garden. So definitely another benefit. So watering and other maintenance. In general, like for a lot of our other plants in our yards, early watering in the morning is the best timing. Do avoid the leaves when possible. That just decreases the risk of either burning from the sun or for introducing things like fungus and other molds along the leaves from kind of spreading around your plants. Do monitor and refill water container gardens as needed. These can evaporate very quickly, especially if it's a shallower pot. So do keep your eye on that if you're deciding to pursue kind of a mini lake or bog garden. Having a timer hooked up to drip irrigation or micro sprayer, if you really want an easy solution that works very well without you having to baby your plants, especially if you have a lot of containers in your garden. Do consider pruning and deadheading as needed. Plants and containers do tend to be a little bit more noticed sometimes in our landscapes. So you might want to keep them a little bit more neat than you would some of the other plants providing wildlife support. However, if you're planting them with a primary purpose of providing that wildlife support, like say leaving coneflowers available for finches to stop by and get some seeds over the winter, chickadees to get some seeds over the winter, then definitely leave them up and kind of let them do their thing. So every few years, you will need to change out the soil, although adding compost can help just to make sure that the plants are getting the nutrients they need since they're kind of removed from the usual nutrient cycling that our in-ground plants are able to benefit from. If you do apply fertilizer, in addition to compost, make sure it is slow release fertilizer and not water soluble, so that keeps it in the pot versus just having it run out and not accessible to your plant roots. So we get this question sometimes, do container gardens count for wildlife certification programs? Yes, indeed they do. So if you have a small garden and you're looking to certify with, say, Audubon at Home, or with some of the other certification programs, definitely still go through with the process. They 100%, especially if you have a diverse range of plants, you can get a lot of the insects and animals coming to your yard that these programs require. So 100%, you can go with all containers or just use containers to augment the plants that you do already have. So this is a really cool recommendation from Homegrown National Park. So this is a program that Dr. Doug Tallamy ended getting up off the ground. And so in our area, we fall into the southeastern U.S. Plains area. And these are keystone plants that this organization is recommending to have. This is not all of the plants, but just for consideration, all of these will work very well in containers. These are all plants that you would find normally in our area and kind of the forest edges and kind of the more forest edges and the more open grassy areas that we have in our region. So these can look quite stunning in containers. Some people may look at these and just think that they look extremely weedy, but I think that containers can really lend a lot of elegance to some of these more common plants that we do tend to see. So this is wild bleeding heart, which to me is not a super found common plant, but I think any of these plants would look very beautiful in the same container. So I think that providing a very visually appealing container and using native plants to put into it, I think you can get some very striking results. And this is a photo from Plant Nova Natives. To me, this is gorgeous. And I think that would look at home in any sort of garden in our area. So other container considerations. So this is kind of a common mix that you'll often see sold at retailers. You have the thriller, which is usually the taller component in the middle. In this case, it's cordyline electric pink. Garden petunia is also very commonly planted in containers as kind of the spiller filler component. And they also included scented geranium in this as well as kind of an additional spiller thriller component, and also to provide a little bit of that fragrance. So that's kind of a common non-native combination. On the right is a plant container that I have. This is year 2 of the design. It needs to be tweaked a little bit. The little blue stem needs to fill out just a little bit to kind of take its place within the rest of the plants. But I think that once it does, it will be a very striking design, hopefully. So this is a mix with the little blue stem, common violet, which in my yard I have everywhere. So it's a great thing to toss into containers as long as they do get a little bit of moisture, because they do tend to dry out a little bit more easily than some of our native plants. Threadleaf coreopsis is also pretty drought resistant and a great container plant. In addition to these, there are also some sedum, autumn joy, which isn't native, but it does provide great pollinator benefit, and it's also very drought tolerant. So this should be a pretty good mix for containers. And I think with a little bit of tweaking, such as keeping the sedum in check just a little bit and allowing that little blue stem to fill in, this kind of replicates the very common design of that thriller, spiller, filler sort of container garden design. Something to consider when you're thinking about natives to put into your plant pots or elsewhere in your garden is the concept of native vars. So there are native plants that seed and plant designers have developed that are kind of very unusual and distinct looking. And while they are technically natives, they've been modified to the point that insects can't use them the same way that they would if they were just straight natives. So this is an example of echinacea. So this is kind of our common purple cone flower. It's not native to our exact area, but a little bit further onto the East Coast. To the right of that is a cultivar called Pica Bella. And so both of these are cultivars, the Sensation Pink and Pica Bella. So these are going to be handled a little bit differently for insects. I think the Sensation Pink is probably not as big of a deal because that flower color is similar, but you have to keep in mind another consideration, which is UV light. So bees, when they're looking for flowers, they have little UV bits that help to direct them to the flowers that they need to go to. So in this case, this cultivar Sensation Pink very likely does not have that. So if you are considering these plants specifically to provide wildlife support, going cultivar less and going to the straight species that are native to our exact area can definitely help to provide that additional wildlife support. In the case of the Pica Bella cultivar, you can see how the ability for insects to get in and get pollen and nectar has just been completely disrupted by all of the additional sepals within the flower head there. So definitely consider that as you're thinking about providing support to our native insects and wildlife. One way that you can find out a little bit more about cultivars is through websites such as this. This is probably my all-time favorite website. This is North Carolina State Extension Gardener Plant Toolbox. You can look up pretty much any native plant, at least in North Carolina. They don't include some of our native plants, unfortunately, but I'm sure they're going to continue to update this, and they do such a great job. I bet they will continue to expand this moving forward. But many of them are included, and they do also include a lot of ornamental plants on this as well. So this can give you a lot more information about what types of cultivars are available and what potentially has been modified about the cultivar. So sometimes you go to garden centers, you can only find cultivars. So this can help guide you a little bit into how it might be disrupted. So in the case of Itia virginica, Virginia sweet spire, there's a very commonly used cultivar called Little Henry. And so what's really been modified with this is it's a shorter version of the original cultivar. So it probably is still going to provide some additional wildlife benefit. It's just been developed to be a little bit on the shorter side to fit into some of our smaller spaces. On the other side, you can see another one of those coneflower cultivars. This is called a hot papaya, and it has that same double flower, which is not going to allow our insects to do what they need to do in the flowers. So this can be a very nice guide for more exploration of these native species. So other benefits of containers is that they can allow plants that may be a little bit more aggressive to not overtake your garden. So in things like mint, even our native mints can be a little bit more on the spreading side. I know this out of my own experience. If you do not like that in your garden, you have a little bit more regimented space. Putting this in a container can be a very nice option for you. Something like hemp dogbane which is in the milkweed family. That can also be a nice thing to put in a container because it will spread massively, but there are actually a lot of caterpillars and also pollinators that do like going to this plant. It has beautiful show-stopping color in the fall as well. Switchgrass and American trumpet creeper are two others that can be a little bit more on the aggressive side, but could be maintained a little bit more within a container setting. Ground covers are also very nice for containers and can provide that really filled in look. Virginia creeper is a very common plant in our area, but it does look quite ornamental in a container, and especially in the fall when it has that really bright red coloration. It can be a truly beautiful sight to have that kind of out of the forest floor a little bit and kind of put up into a container if you have a few extras. You can also have them get a greater potential to seed out if they're getting a little bit more flower, and seed out if they're getting a little bit more sun, so that can be an added benefit. But all these others are also very dense, tend to be very dense vegetation, so all of these would be quite beautiful in containers as well. We do have some that are just very visually appealing. I became acquainted with rattlesnake master recently, and it's just such a beautiful, striking plant. So I think that putting that in a container would really capture people's attention, and it would really stand out well with kind of other shorter plants in the area. Purple passion flower, swamp rose mallow, and of course, one of our favorites, cardinal flower. All these would do great in containers as well and do really tend to be quite striking. Native trees can also work with a little bit of care. Remember the note about making sure that you're either insulating the container, providing a very roomy container, or making sure that the tree itself is hardy up to a more northern zone to make sure it's going to be able to survive. So there was a few researchers that took a look at this, and so these are all recommended trees that should be able to tolerate container conditions. So hackberry, the many hawthorns that we have, honey locust, which is a very drought tolerant and kind of pollution tolerant tree. American holly is another great one that will also be able to tolerate some shade. It could be nice in kind of like a patio type setting if you have some other trees in the area, instead of kind of the more frequently used like arbor vitae or something like that. So going back to that traditional structural combo of thrillers, spillers, and fillers. So just a few other things that might work well. Sensitive ferns ferns in general will get a lot of height, and they tend to do very well in containers. So depending on the type of fern, you could use it as either a filler or a thriller. So in this case, I think it would be a very pretty thriller, having some additional plants around the base. Eastern columbine is another one that will bloom in early spring. After that time, you could have another thriller pop up after that. So do consider as well kind of that bloom period and kind of when some of these plants do tend to die back. Pink muleygrass is another one that's just a very striking and pretty visually interesting grass that would be very nice within that thriller segment. Fillers, I think you have a lot of options for this. There's a lot of dense ground covers that would work well. So stonecrop is one of our native sedums that would do well in this. Creeping phlox is one that you can find very regularly in many garden centers. So this should be an easy one to find that would work well. Wild ginger tends to like a little bit of moister, shadier conditions. But if you have that for your containers, again, great option. Spillers are a little bit more challenging, but I think a lot of our plants will flop a little bit and can kind of provide that trailing visual interest. So wild bleeding heart, like we saw in the earlier photo, is one. Wild strawberry, so not our mock strawberry, which is considered to be kind of more of a lawn and garden weed than anything else, but our actually wild native strawberry will tend to kind of droop over a little bit and have very pretty flowers in spring, and will have nice deeply colored leaves throughout the year as well. Foam flower is another option with very beautiful flowers as well. So that was kind of a brief overview of what sort of plants you can put into containers, especially with a focus on native plants. These are some of the resources that I use to take a look at your plant options. And thank you very much for joining us. Here are some of our social media as well. So if you have any questions, I'd be very glad to answer them. And thanks again for joining. Checking the chat just in case. All right, seeing none, thanks again. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us today at Virginia Cooperative Extension Prince William. Thanks again and take care.